I can't resist. Top of the morning, as it is a happy St. Patrick's Day 2021. We are continuing our discussions, our policy discussions. We had left off last week with talking about the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, passing their version of the George Floyd Act. Since then, not only has that occurred, but in the civil side of the George Floyd case in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a civil judgment has been rendered as the jury is now going through its selection in the criminal aspects of the case. I'm Steve Foster. I am a member of the African American Lawyer Section of the State Bar of Texas, also former committee director and general counsel of the Texas Senate Committee on Criminal Justice, along with Kevin Lawrence from TMPA, Doug Griffith, now president of the Houston Peace Officers Association. Is that correct? Is that
Houston
correct?
Police Officers Union.
Police Officers Union, and Travis Hammond up from the Irving Police Department, and also one of the first vice presidents of TMPA. With that, we get back into the discussion. And Kevin, I'm not sure if I can hear you, sir.
The first vice president.
The first vice president from Irving. And in fact, I'll leave that. Let's just get into the discussion. I was just going to note that, the original Texas Stadium where the original 88 Drew Pearson played his professional football. I'm still elated that he's been finally elected 38 years later into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So when I hear Irving, and I've been to that original stadium, that salute to him. And he's a great American, and can't wait for that later on in the summer. Meanwhile,
I worked many of those games.
There we go. There had been, as mentioned, a judgment. And so it takes us to, no.
A settlement.
A settlement. And that the vernacular is true, because a settlement means an agreement between two parties, less an adjudicated scenario in front of a judge. So with that, we talk about one of the primary points in the Texas legislation and qualified immunity. And the reason why we go straight to that is qualified immunity doesn't go to the issues of training and law enforcement. It doesn't go to administrative processes and procedures with transparency if there are bad actors or questionable actors in a department or agency. We have 2,700 in the state of Texas. This goes to a basic premise of money damages in regards to an act, whether the actor is deemed bad by public opinion, social media, less a trier of fact, and it does not go to the criminal penal code aspect of an episode involving law enforcement and civilians. So we want to make sure that there's two separate columns when we're talking about remedies, solutions, and moving forward in a way that does not incite or create protest. And one of those things that must be remembered is we've looked at the aspects of better training, more dollars for the training, a bigger police force, because again, so many services, and the debate has been, do you have services that are strictly non-police, staying outside of law enforcement, or do you incorporate some of those because there's a more community approach to law enforcement, which would then foster better relationships amongst the civilians and law enforcement? Given the fact that there's been a settlement, going back to qualified immunity allows an aggrieved or an offended citizen to somehow come forward and prove and attach a damage award or seek to have the trier of fact have a damage award given to that person due to that episode with law enforcement. Now, so far, qualified immunity is only a judicial creation of case law, except I believe in New Jersey and Colorado. As good as it may seem to have someone be able to get past law enforcement to a political subdivision and basically two things, either go through sovereign immunity, which a lot of people recognize, or if you're looking on the civil side, pierce the corporate veil because that protection is then lost by one of those political subdivisions, city, county, state, or what have you. The bottom line is it does not go to necessarily improving your law enforcement and what it does specifically in the details. What it does allow is for an aggrieved estate, family, or individual civilian and citizen to be able to receive monetary damages. And with that, that is certainly a different lane than looking to improve and to modify and to update the things that go on in the processes of law enforcement. Again, being able to see if there's an officer that has had complaints, updating techniques when you interface with civilians and citizens in an episode, or any of the administrative updates that we look at TCOL, which is now in review, sunset review, as a state agency in the state of Texas. So that's a lot to be said. And again, very simply put, as we were speaking before we went live, follow the money. And the money is an aspect that is outside of the processes of law enforcement, except money is a means to drive training, implicit bias opportunities to explain, because there are different groups in law enforcement, and there are different groups that law enforcement will come upon in their daily activities. So you have to understand, do you want to improve the ability of the citizens to receive damages, or are you trying to look for improvements in law enforcement across the board and how law enforcement processes, procedures, and administrative functions are delegated, run, and completed on a daily basis? I hope I set that up to have the discussion, because I think what we had intended to initially look at when you talk about policy, and you hear Kevin Lawrence, if you followed us from TMPA, talk about policy. Good policy, good law enforcement policy is what the agreement needs to have. And that's why, as lawyers, we look towards those policies and procedures as well, because we know those things set the parameters that will govern the actions, activities, and the administration of law enforcement. Doug,
Agreed.
you've been nodding, and I think that at least I've framed this so that, if we want to get to that policy side that Kevin talks about a lot, that is wholly different than a settlement or an award to a citizen that's been a part of an episode.
Correct. Well, when you're talking about the qualified immunity aspect of it, you have to understand that the qualified immunity they're talking about is for the individual officer. Well, that's not where the money is. And these attorneys know that.
Right.
It's actually probably going to be a detriment to those that actually should be receiving money. We had
explain that why you said that would be a detriment. And I just,
because it could absolve that qualified immunity if the city can show that they were acting outside the bounds of the policies and procedures, then that would absolve the city from any culpability to pay out for anything. So that would be just the officers. And everybody knows, if they're making $50,000, $60,000 a year, they don't have money. You're not getting anything from them.
right.
Where you have the city as their backing, that's where they're going after the money at. I mean, in the Floyd incident, $27 million. Well, those officers don't have that. Why do you think they settled so quick? Because I think that was a pretty quick settlement, to be quite honest with you. And why? I think it's because they're going to show that they had probably some bad policies in place that allowed that to happen. One being the way they train with using a knee on the neck. That, to me, speaks volumes as to what happened and why the city settled so quickly.
And again, Kevin had made mention about some of the facts that the knee, and again, Kevin, I don't want to speak for you, but I want to highlight this because the important thing about these discussions we have is that we get the opportunity, unbiased, without elected officials or anything like that. And I'm not saying elected officials are taint this, but again, we're looking for solutions that don't force us to have to get either reelected or answer to a constituency. And so I want to have us break down what we say to y'all enough so that you can see when Doug and Kevin and Travis, as experienced law enforcement personnel and leaders, say these things, that you can see along the way as they're describing these things, why each element of what they say is important and the relevance of it to the discussion. So you pointed out something with regard to a fact with the knee, 8 minutes 46 seconds. However, Kevin, you had mentioned that it's not necessarily been determined, even though that looks completely egregious, and people will certainly say that. And we've mentioned it several times. You could have set the gentleman upright. You had control. Kevin, you mentioned the fact that has it been proven in the courts system that the knee was in fact the proximate cause, as we say in law, of the rationale of what. Now, there could be a ton of people that go, Steve, come on, you don't have to be Marcus Welby or anybody like that to know that knee on the neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds means X. Again, I give you the floor, Kevin, because there are some things that need to be discussed, but no question, that is a bad, awful look.
I get it. The optics of it are horrible. However, you do have to be Marcus Welby in order to figure out whether or not the knee on the back of the neck or the knee in the small of the back or anything else actually was a contributing factor. You have to have medical degrees, medical experts get on the stands and explain to a jury what happened and why it happened. And that hasn't happened yet. So Doug makes a great point. Why is the city settling so fast? We have to believe that there's going to be a whole lot of systemic failures pointed out during this trial, systemic failures in leadership, in training, in guidance, in policies within the Minneapolis Police Department. What I want to get back to is the folks, the proponents of doing away with qualified immunity keep claiming it protects bad cops, it protects bad cops, it protects bad cops. Really? Why'd they settle then? If the city could have hidden behind qualified immunity, why would they write a check for $27 million to anybody?
And they got a 13-0 vote from the city council of Minneapolis as well. So that's right. A cross section that's a population that is not looking a lot like me, but a lot more like Kevin and Doug.
But
and so
it's prima facie evidence, but isn't it pretty good circumstantial evidence that qualified immunity does not do what the proponents of these bills claim that it do?
Well, that's what we're getting at, because you have to, I think when you hear phrases and terms, you automatically come up with, oh, that means a certain thing. That means a certain thought. That goes to a certain process. That's not the case. I think a lot of this has not been deciphered when you talk about getting most of your information from social media or, news people. And again, I know the media fairly well at this point, being in sports media as well. You cannot get the real basics across a lot of times when you're just giving somewhat of a sensationalized look across the board. That's why we attempt to break this down so that we give you a recognition of the facts, at least at what we have currently. And
I think
qualified immunity, when you hear this buzz phrase, does not necessarily equate to what most would think. Just like defunding the police is not something that necessarily equates to what general populace may perceive it means. And at this point, qualified immunity, which is a court creation through case law, may not serve the public as the public deems that it is their perception of what it means.
another very important point you make there, Steve, is that perception that somehow the public has got their minds made up that they know what this term means and what that term means, and therefore they know what the verdict ought to be. The problem with that is, as an attorney, if you ask a dozen people, what does common law marriage entail? You will get 12 distinctly different interpretations. But you know what? When they go into a courtroom to fight out a divorce or
Right.
a settlement, a separation of property,
Right.
you're going to realize that what they thought they knew doesn't matter to that judge.
Right. You must satisfy the material elements of that particular.
What is in statute? What matters is the language, the words that are used in statute, and whether or not they are defined either in that statute or in some other statute to give the courts direction about how to do things. The same thing applies to cops. When we have laws, when we have policies, when we have regulations, that's what we're telling the officers, that this is what we expect you to do. Qualified immunity basically says if we're going to hold cops personally responsible, liable for their actions, we at least better check and make sure we've given them clear direction about what we want them to do. That's all it's about.
Right. And that's why our focus has been on the policy, the process, the leadership, and the procedures, because it does run downhill. You get the good policies, processes, procedures, administration of law enforcement more towards optimal in situations, then you don't have to go to this scenario per se of having this big deal about a phrase that truly just goes back to those elements that, if satisfied properly with training, with policies, with process and procedure, you're not going to have the big concern unless you're a plaintiff's attorney. And again, nothing wrong with plaintiff's attorney. I support them. You're going to have a better environment to have citizens and law enforcement coexist, I believe, in a much improved way. So that's why we focused on policy. That's why we focused on saying taking funding away from training is the exact 180 of what the populace would want. Clearly, we know if there's no law enforcement, that's a field day for the bad guys. You have to understand that. If you don't believe that, you don't have to go to a major city. You can go to a medium, modest city and see that there's going to be illegal activity that goes on. If there's no one to come against the resistance of that bad force, that force will continue to move. It's a Newton's law. An object in motion will stay in motion. You must resist it. Law enforcement in its basic premises resist those types of things in our communities and society. What we don't like, go ahead, Kev.
I want to take that opportunity to talk about something. Cops, yes. That's not the sum total of the job that law enforcement officers have.
No,
it's not just to fight the bad, the very bad people amongst
correct.
Them, though that's a very important part. But I feel compelled to talk about what happened down in Galveston.
Sure.
I saw on Tucker Carlson the other night, was the first time I'd actually seen what had happened. And I guess it was the police department that decided to release the video. But anybody who haven't seen it among our viewers, there was a 65-year-old woman went into a bank not wearing a mask. And it's the day after the governor's rescission of the statewide mask mandate went into effect. She believed, I don't have to wear a mask anymore. But the bank still had signs up that said, we require you to use a face covering. So she gets in there and the employee tries to tell her, ma'am, you can't be in here without a mask. As she decides to give the employee, a bunch of trouble about it, they get into an argument. The employee then calls a manager over. The manager starts talking to her and says, ma'am, I'm sorry, but we have a rule. You either have to put on a mask or we're going to have to ask you to leave. The manager's like, fine, I want you to leave. You're not welcome here. And so she continues arguing. So the manager then summoned an officer. Apparently the officer was working an extra job at the bank anyway. He summons the officer over and the officer tries to tell her the same exact thing. The owner of this establishment has said, you're not welcome here unless you do X. And she says, I don't have to do X. The governor said I don't have to do X. As you can imagine.
And you knew this was coming. You knew this was coming. That's when I spoke about the lowest common denominator. I don't want to wear a mask. I don't want to distance. And it was coming. Go ahead. I digress.
That situation deteriorated. And he finally said, fine, you're going to have to leave. And then she refused to leave. And he said, okay, then you're going to jail. And then she resisted and he had to take her to the floor and handcuff her and take her to jail. That officer, now she wasn't a violent criminal. She just simply wasn't complying with the law, with the request of the owner of that property, a lawful request that they had made. And when they told her you're no longer welcome here, at that point, when she refused to leave, she's trespassing. Then she commits the offense of resisting arrest. So now she's arrested for trespassing and resisting arrest. What did Tucker Carlson call it? They brutally took her to the floor for not wearing a mask. That's not what the cop did. The cop doesn't care if she's wearing a mask or not. The cop cares that the owner of the property had asked her to leave and she refused. The cop's doing his job. To is the cop the bad guy here?
Well,
Fred, I'll let you talk about it.
Well, it goes to the and Fred, you're muted if you're talking to us.
I was actually talking to my roommate, so
okay.
But it would probably look like I was talking to you guys.
No problem. Fred, we're happy to have you in today's discussion.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. When it goes back to one of the basic tenets that you have discussed, Kevin, policy. And when you give a policy that still has some gray, even if it has nothing to do with drugs or guns or anything like that, you still have law enforcement that has to make decisions within the citizenry. And I don't know how you come about it, but the point you make is the description of it is grossly disproportionate to what the actual, even with the releasing of it, you still already had somebody on national media on TV give a description that law enforcement says, well, that's not the case. And if you look back at the fact pattern, they in fact weren't, I don't think, out of whack in that situation. You tell me, I'm not the subject matter expert.
First of all, how do you give a direction, a law, a statute, whatever, that doesn't have some measure of gray in it? That's why there has to be a trier of fact. There's a gray in there's gray in the 10 Commandments, for crying out loud. Somebody has to interpret and apply and enforce all those statutes. So just simply claiming, well, they didn't understand it, I'm sorry. How hard is it to understand? You're not welcome here. There's the door.
Stephen, you
or just comply.
When you're talking about policies and stuff like that, some of our policy manuals are 500 pages. I don't know how big Doug is down there at in Houston, but when you're talking about that and we're trying to remember all of these things, in a matter of seconds when it's deteriorating, That's a difficult task in itself that we're trying to remember.
So let me ask you this.
By the way, Stephen, I
Yeah.
want Travis makes an extremely important point there. Think about this. If we have one standard in the qualified immunity provision, and we have another standard in Chapter 9 of the Penal Code that talks about use of force, and then we get another standard with regard to federal civil rights laws, and we got yet another standard in departmental policy, which one is the officer supposed to follow at that given instant, at that specific point in time? Because they may not all be the same. They all have gray in them.
Well, and that's part of this discussion, because again, I was going to use the example, since we're in Texas, that one of my beloved teams, the Dallas Cowboys, they had been given, their defense had been given a very complex system to follow. Just kind of like you said, there's so many different instances of rules, processes, and procedures. When the defense kind of was allowed to be more simplistic, they didn't have to go through 4, 5, 6 different things per play, per episode. They played much better as athletes, just doing what they were supposed to do, because the complexities had them thinking way too much, and the actions and activities weren't really coming across well. I think in a similar situation, Kevin, you're saying if an officer in an episode is having to think about 4 or 5 different points of policy trying to come together in that one instant in time, you're almost paralyzed by which one do I follow? How do I get it done? Which one takes precedent? Is this one more important than that one? By the time you try to attempt to figure it out, your actions towards anyone in that instance is probably going to be 50 to 60% at best what you wanted for that personnel at that time. Simplify this so you don't have 500 pages. And again, maybe, Travis, that's because they're trying to cover every instance. Those instances are going to get, you can't cover them with 500. If you got 500 pages, you could probably have 700 pages, which means you probably could have 1,000 pages.
Well, there's a lot of them.
Every year they get bigger and bigger, let me tell you.
No doubt. But this is exactly why the framers of the Constitution made it really simple for us. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly told us it's this simple right here, folks. The standard is reasonableness. We do not have, there's a very important case out of, I believe it was North Carolina 4 or 5 years ago, where the Supreme Court said, look, our citizens have no right to expect our law enforcement officers to behave perfectly. They are human beings. They will never be perfect. What we have a right to is to expect them to behave reasonably. And reasonableness should be determined based upon the facts of that specific case, known to that officer at that moment in time, and nothing else should matter. And that's, you know what, that's about as ungray as we can get it. The problem is we've got a lot of people who look at the videos, decide that they know what happened, they know what the law is, they know what just happened, they know what the outcome ought to be. They convince themselves, they create these unreasonable expectations, and then when the outcome doesn't turn out that way because they were wrong with their premise to start with, now they're upset and they think there's something wrong with the law that has to be changed because it didn't meet their perception.
And I showed y'all this just a minute ago. This is literally.
That's your policy manual.
We have, and a lot of them relate to each other. So on a traffic stop, there's 4 or 5 different policies in there you got to adhere to for one traffic stop. You're supposed to know all that around the clock, no matter what you're doing. It's just not possible.
And how often is it updated?
We have a new one come out every so many days.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't stop. It just doesn't stop.
So who's creating these policies? Who can say, all right, I've got 4 of these. Doug has pointed out I have 4 of these for a traffic stop. How can we streamline this? Again, you're giving me the Mike Nolan defense. I got to know A, B, C, and D. Well, dang it. I just want to play outside linebacker. If I see that guy coming this way, I turn him inside. If he has the ball, I squash him, I close him down. Hopefully there's enough upfield push and we tackle this guy. That's very simple. I can understand that. I can read and react most anytime with that directive. If I've got four things, hey, you need to be standing in certain ways, you need to angle yourself this way, then that's a lot to incur in split seconds. So
And
Doug, go
what
ahead.
Dallas has is completely different from what Houston has, and what Houston has is completely different from what Irving has. And you have to understand, it gets changed every time there is an anecdote that creates a new policy. There's something happened that just looked bad. And now we've got to create a new policy because the city's all worried about getting sued again. So they create new policy to try and make sure that that specific event just doesn't happen again. And that's bad management.
Now, that's reactionary policies that
It is.
increase your volume each and every time. And as you say, because we're people and we're human, we're going to come up with a variety. That's trying to say that you're going to add a piece of paper for every time your child does X. We're going to prevent it with this technique here. We're going to have a different one for Slitterbond, then we do HEB, then we do the movie theater, then we do, sports activities, scouting, music lessons. You can see you're going to have volume of processes and procedures for each one of these. No, I need good behavior, son or daughter. You
Right.
can condense that down to a very simplistic methodology without having to have a policy or a situation for every instant that your child is going to come across or your teenager is going to come across in life, because that manual is going to be thousands of pages.
Right. And the more those policies contradict one another, the more that the officers have to deal with conflicting direction, the less law enforcement we are going to get.
Correct.
Like you said, the officers are going to be paralyzed by indecision. They're going to be having to figure out, okay, which policy do I follow this time? Which termination do I want to fight? Do I want to fight the termination because I disobeyed this policy or because I disobeyed that policy? It's a
It
no-win.
also has a big morale component to it when you start looking at this, because just like us, if we get a complaint, it goes to ID. ID looks at every single thing that the officer did. Okay. If I took my seatbelt off early when I pulled into an apartment complex, I'm not supposed to take my seatbelt off until I put the car in park. If I pull into an apartment complex, I take my seatbelt off. We're going to get dinged for that. Probably going to get a written reprimand or a day off. Okay. Then you've got, oh, you know what? I turned my body camera on 15 seconds too late after I stepped out of the car, instead before I got out of the car. I'm going to get hit with that. They're going to cite you for every single thing. We had an officer the other day on a felony traffic stop get cited because he didn't double lock the handcuffs before he threw the guy into the car and went back to engage the second suspect in the car. I mean, it's little things like that that kill morale and will force officers to stop doing proactive policing.
So how can we scrub these policies, these processes, these procedures, recognizing that it is creating even more skewed outcomes that are not optimal? And when you're having to have that thought, you're really not focused necessarily on the person in front of you. Mix in some unfamiliarity because maybe you're a newer officer, mix in the fact, and again, I've said this, the population for Black Americans in particular is about 12%. That doesn't mean everybody in the country has had interaction with Black America. So now you send someone out doing their job, it's unfamiliar. You're looking at these processes and you see someone you just haven't encountered most ever or at all in your life. You're still trying to maintain law and order. I'm not saying that's an excuse, but unfamiliarity does breed some sort of apprehension. I'm not going to say it's going to create a bias necessarily. It can, it may, but you're trying to work through sequentially what you're supposed to do. And I think that's what you're getting at, Doug. And when it gets reviewed, there's so many things. A golf swing, a baseball swing. Does your elbow have to be up? Not if you can hit it 400 feet and it works like this for you. It may not work for everyone, but you can't tell someone who has a different style and it's effective that that's a wrong thing to do in your training and technique because it works for that individual. There needs to be an allowed flexibility so that the bottom line of law enforcement can do its job without causing, consternation between the officers, law enforcement, and citizens. That's really where we want to get. Don't matter in having the encounter. We just don't want the encounters to be so unorthodox and not, as we interact, and then you have outcomes that we don't particularly need or like.
Well, one of the things I would love to see us try to delve into, and some people agree with me, some people don't, is the thought of education-based discipline. Because you discipline guys, you get disciplined tomorrow for whatever policy violation, but has that taught you anything? If you get 2 days off for a policy violation, have they actually corrected the behavior?
No.
No. How about let's put them in a class and teach them the proper way to do this and then move forward? And, it's, I don't know, maybe I'm pie in the sky guy, but I think if we taught people better, it's like telling your kid, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. But why? Why not? Why?
Take
Because
that,
you will get,
Doug, put them in a
Sorry?
classroom, put them in a classroom and tell them they have to teach all the other cops how not to do that next time.
exactly. That'll fix that problem. I'll guarantee it.
Well, that takes some time, that takes money, and that takes effort. And I think that's what we're saying. We want policies that get the result not to occur improperly repeatedly. You have to
Well, and
break
also
that cycle.
keep in mind that most of the policies, like was stated earlier, that they come from one instance. That may not be an actual problem throughout. So how about we simply deal with that instance?
And again, have policies that are more overarching and not specific, so you can take those 8 or 9 notebooks and make it 3, where you can go back and refer and educate law enforcement with regards to that, as opposed to trying to memorize the 14-step plan for this instance, a 4-step plan for a traffic stop, a 3-step plan for whatever. Because I think bias and that type of over policy situation is creating these instances, even though they're small, and we've gone to the numbers, and I think those numbers are reliable. I think these gentlemen will stand in front, beside, and behind these numbers. You have to recognize those things are getting highlighted, as you mentioned, Kevin, as a brutal takedown, which was not the case. And these are 2 white Americans, white Texans in a bank. This wasn't an issue of color, ethnicity. This was process and procedure.
Right. And for law enforcement, we have never argued that race doesn't play a role at all. But what we have argued is vast, overwhelming majority of the time, officers couldn't possibly care less about race or ethnicity. Officers care about the circumstance that is taking place at that moment, at that point in time. And that's what they're focused on. White, black, brown, polka dot, doesn't make any difference to us.
Yeah.
And let me toss something out there, because it's an interesting point. Look at the Eric Garner case. What did for like selling cigarettes? The officers we don't get to choose what laws are put on the books. Our job is to enforce those laws. Hell, to be quite honest, we disagree with some of those laws, but we're charged with enforcing them. And if our commanders come to us and say, hey, you're gonna do this, this is what your job is today. Y'all are gonna go out and hit these guys for selling illegal cigarettes. Okay, that's our job today. That's what we're gonna go do. and it ended up bad. Everybody wants to blame the officer on that deal, when in reality, wouldn't their time be better served going after real criminals instead of some guys selling untaxed cigarettes? I'm just saying there's all kinds of things that we have to look at in the legislative level. There are laws out there that are just ridiculous that we are having to enforce, and that makes us the bad guy.
And Doug brings up a great point there. You know, the officer is only enacting the law that the state or the municipality is saying to go do, like a seatbelt law. You know, hey guys, we've had several accidents right here. We need you guys to hit them with the seatbelts, hit them with the speeding in the school zone. Well, then you pull up to the car. I'll give you a perfect example of our motor jocks in McKinney. You would not believe, and this goes for all motor jocks across the country. A motor jock is a motorcycle officer. The way that they are talked to on a traffic stop is mind-boggling, and they could care less. They are stone robots because they don't have anywhere to put a body to make an arrest. They have to get a squad over there to do that. So they're scratching a ticket and they're going to the next. And the way the public talks to them is the most mind-boggling thing you'd ever seen. We need to do a series of just body cam of motor jocks, because they will tell them to go die. Your whole family dies. I hope your family gets run over by an 8. You would not believe the conversations that they get into with a pedestrian or with anybody that they come in contact with that's not having a great day. And those guys go on to do their job. Doug also brought up the Eric Garner case. You know, those officers were sent there. They were sent there to fix the problem with Eric because he had been there over repeatedly. And then they get in the conversation with him. He's a big guy. He's an out of shape guy. He had been warned by the folks there at the store to stop. He had been approached by the officers before to stop doing it. So who put themselves in that position? He did. And so, but the officers did what they did, you know, to put him in custody. And you know what? Putting hands on people never looks good. If I tried to arrest you right now, Stephen, and you didn't want to go, it's going to look ugly. And those tactics get thrown out the window because your arm goes here, my arm goes there, my leg goes here. All those things go out the window because the only thing you're trying to do at that point is survive. You know, I give you
and that's the important thing. At that point, a lot of primary instincts come into play.
Yeah,
no matter what color. I can tell you that because I've been in a few, and I just wanted to make it to the rest of the evening and the next day. And so,
you know, the locker rooms is bad with folks and
how many people in that incident?
You know, those squalls that you have with your friends and teammates, they get ugly. You know, and especially they get ugly with people you don't know, because then you really don't have that personal relationship. You're like, you become 2 points that are going to come to a head there. And that happens in law enforcement because you've got two groups that are coming together, and whether it's 1-on-1 and somebody's got to leave the room, you know, and it's usually going to be the cop with cuffs on the person they came in contact with, and it's just going to look bad.
And only one of them has rules of engagement they have to worry about.
Yeah, that's the truest statement right there. Only one has rules of engagement, but in every fight with an officer or every time an officer has contact, no matter what, there's a gun involved. And that's the one thing the public never understands. They're like, what do you mean? The person was unarmed? Nope, because the officer came into the fight with a gun. And when the officer comes in with the gun, that means there's a gun involved, because that gun is going to be part of the situation now, because that gun is on that officer's person.
There's a lot of things, and Kevin, and I appreciate you agreeing to do our town hall with us, because so much of this information, I don't think anyone's ever heard in a fashion and in a form that really lays out what both sides are looking at, citizens and law enforcement. And before you want to retract something from law enforcement, before you want to disband something in law enforcement, it would behoove us to understand it. We haven't talked in colors. We've talked process, procedure, and policy. Those things are going to rule the day along with primary instincts given each incident that you would have with the public. The public is underinformed. I don't want to even say misinformed, but underinformed. We wanted to bring this out to really sit down and figure out. And it's not an easy task. I think it's going to take a while, even though we've shown and highlighted a lot of things to go back and check the boxes to get things done. And I pray that Kevin or Doug or someone is part of that panel, the blue ribbon panel in Texas, because there needs to be a lot of discussion before you just, again, kind of put a policy out there because of one specific instance. It needs to be done in a way that is beneficial for law enforcement with its interaction in regards to its citizens and protecting the law enforcement officers. That there's two sides to that coin. And that's what we did in the committee. Yes, we wanted to protect our citizens because protect and serve is what law enforcement does, but you must protect law enforcement as well. I have two favorite cousins. They're black. They're law enforcement officers in the state of New Jersey. I don't want them at a disadvantage. I enjoy seeing them. I want them as part of my family as cousins. So I wouldn't want to put them in a situation that makes it beneficial for a bad actor. And you have to recognize that police forces just aren't completely homogeneous to one particular ethnicity. We want policies that work for people who are law enforcement involved, period, regardless of color. And if we do need to insert, which I think we do, some implicit bias training, that helps everybody in that situation. Fred, you brought one of the most important scenarios up is if the officer or the deputy or the trooper or constable is now inserted into a situation, a gun is involved, a weapon is involved. You can't take that out of the equation. Kevin, I know you need to go. Thank you, sir. Uh, have a great time. We're about finishing up.
See you
Enjoy,
guys next week.
enjoy St. Patrick's Day. We still want to say that we want to create a positive environment. But Fred, as you mentioned, there's some things that we have to look at and do in the right way. And I think and it's painstaking. We're on our 30th plus week in getting to all of this because there's so much involved when you talk about interaction and training and process and procedures and policies with law enforcement. It's a big task.
It's a huge task and it's an everyday task. I tell this when I speak at anywhere. Right now, somewhere in America, an officer's pulling over a car. Somewhere right now, an officer is in danger of losing his life, and the people that he's around are in danger of losing their life because they're up to something no good. And so right now, that's happening right now, and it doesn't stop 24 hours a day. That's happening. And that's hard to understand, but right now that car is being pulled over. There's a gun in that car. There's a bad actor in that car, and there's an officer doing his job.
Well, Fred, let's say this. I recognize your statement wholeheartedly, but I have to believe there's some citizens that say, "Hey, I got pulled over. I don't have a gun.
Yeah.
I don't have a record, and I know law enforcement saw what they thought. And again, that's why there's probable cause and reasonable suspicion.
Yep.
And you go through it. I recall, and and I was not happy about this. A third-year law student, just finished working out with my buddy Big Rob Johnson, who has been a Cook County prosecutor for decades. You have two black gentlemen in a vehicle going to lunch. We got stopped, and we were held there for 20 minutes as protocols were run. We tried to explain we were law students, but again, law enforcement did what they needed to do. Those things will happen as well. I wasn't happy about it. I was hungry, but there was no incident. And we moved forward. I probably I think the county attorney know about it. Like, hey, you got to recognize we're working in your criminal clinic. We're not the bad guys.
Yeah.
However, those are intermingled into everyday scenarios when there are bad actors or potential bad actors. And so you have to kind of have, again, I in the big picture, I'd rather you kind of do that and move on so that you do find the bad actor than just kind of just allow the bad actor to do what they're going to do and then you're reactionary.
Well, Stephen, we have no idea who that is.
Right.
Anytime we make a stop or come
Right.
into contact with people, our guys stopped I think it was a 2018 BMW the other day and got 12 pounds of heroin.
Right.
So we
Right.
just have no idea.
Right. You have to do some policing. But again, I think policies, training, and things of that nature can assist, but it's not an easy task. You don't have x-ray vision to look through all the vehicles. If you did, you probably could have different policies. We don't have that. So we have to take the commonsensical approach. And I think we've pointed out again, when we're talking about policies, maybe they need to be condensed to have more overarching and not specifics to each individual thing that pops up that creates another page or another chapter in this. Because again, I think it is doing some of these officers and law enforcement agencies a disservice.
Mhm.
So it's not easy. I appreciate the discussions. We're going to have to go through this at some point and pull out what makes sense, because we'll catch some things for the legislative session in 2021, but there could be some things that don't need legislation that can still improve law enforcement for the citizens of the state of Texas and possibly beyond, if we can be a model for others. We have a sizable state with a sizable population, and if it can work for the 254 counties in Texas, I'm sure we'd all be happy to share those policies and procedures that we've taken a look at, made a modification, made some great suggestions, and then also made it that, yes, if in fact there needs to be a recovery of damages, that's fine. If there needs to be reprimands, people recognize now that there's citizen boards, there's people that take looks at law enforcement and their actions and activities on a regular basis. The other thing is we need to take this information to the public so that they're better and well educated on actually what's going on around them, whether they encounter law enforcement or not. Because I think that would put us all on a different level and different footing with how we took the approach and had a perspective of law enforcement that is around us in everyday circumstances.
Stephen, if law enforcement leaders around this state did their job and did their job properly, there'd be no need for legislation.
That's a mouthful, because you're saying, and you're in the fourth largest city in our country, that there is some things that should be done with inside these agencies with improvement would also again trickle down to the public that's being served. We'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that. I hope everyone has a great day. We will continue next Wednesday. I appreciate the transparency and the openness and the honesty. That's going to, again, when we recapture all of what we've done, we can make and we will make progress. And it doesn't necessarily need to be legislatively in its design. So appreciate y'all, Doug, Fred, Travis, Alicia. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. And again, happy St.
Thanks.
Patrick's Day.
Y'all have a good one.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Thank you, Stephen.